For most of his life, Johnny Depp existed behind masks. Not the theatrical kind alone, but emotional ones. Characters became shields, accents became armor, and transformation became escape. Audiences believed they knew him because he lived so vividly on-screen, yet the man underneath remained largely untouched by public understanding. By his early 40s, Depp wasn't just a successful actor, he was a symbol. A symbol of rebellion, excess, artistic defiance. And symbols are dangerous things, because once they stop serving the story people want, they are dismantled without mercy. This documentary is not about innocence or guilt in a courtroom sense. It is about how a human being is slowly flattened into a headline, and what remains when the noise finally stops. To understand Johnny Depp's collapse, you have to look long before the lawsuits, before the viral clips, before the verdicts. You have to look at how fame doesn't just elevate people, it distorts the feedback they receive, until silence feels safer than truth. And that distortion is where this story really begins. By the mid-2000s, Johnny Depp was operating inside a contradiction. Professionally untouchable, personally unraveling. His films dominated global box offices, yet behind closed doors, instability had already taken root. Excessive drinking wasn't hidden. Substance abuse wasn't denied. Hotel rooms were destroyed, not whispered about. What matters here is not the behavior itself, but how it was interpreted. For years, the industry framed his chaos as artistic temperament. Fans romanticized it. Studios tolerated it because the returns were enormous. This normalization matters because it trained everyone, including Depp himself, to mistake dysfunction for personality. When destructive behavior is rewarded, it stops feeling like a warning sign. It becomes identity. And when identity collapses, there is nothing left to retreat into. Depp would later admit that he never believed he was immune to consequences. He simply believed they would arrive privately, quietly, humanely. That assumption would prove fatal to his public life. The collapse didn't come because he was flawed. It came because the world decided those flaws were no longer entertaining. When allegations of domestic abuse entered the public sphere, nuance vanished almost instantly. The conversation didn't evolve, it hardened. This is crucial context. The cultural climate at the time was shifting rapidly toward moral absolutism. Complex stories were compressed into slogans. Silence was treated as guilt. Defense was treated as manipulation. Depp found himself inside a machine that did not pause for clarification. What followed wasn't just public outrage, it was social acceleration. Studios didn't wait. Brands didn't investigate. Distance became policy. In moments like this, industries don't ask what's true, they ask what's safe, and uncertainty is never safe. Depp later described this period as watching his life get narrated by people who had never met him. He wasn't fighting accusations alone, he was fighting a system that had already priced him out. The speed of judgment mattered more than its accuracy. Once the story was set, revering it became nearly impossible. Inside courtrooms, Johnny Depp did something rare. He admitted his failures openly. He did not sanitize his addictions. He did not deny his volatility. He spoke candidly about drinking heavily, about drugs, about emotional collapse. What he rejected was the conclusion that these flaws equaled physical violence. This distinction was lost on the public narrative. Addiction, in popular imagination, became shorthand for abuse. Rage became synonymous with harm. Depp's legal defense wasn't about presenting himself as virtuous. It was about refusing to be simplified. And simplification is where public destruction thrives. The more honest he was, the more footage existed to weaponize. Videos of him slamming cabinets became proof of character rather than moments of context. The court examined details. The public consumed clips. This gap between legal process and media digestion widened daily, and Depp was trapped in the middle of it. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of Depp's collapse wasn't the accusations themselves, it was abandonment. People he had trusted for decades didn't defend him. They didn't call. They didn't ask questions. Some stayed quiet. Others testified against him. One longtime agent described him as difficult under oath, effectively rewriting 30 years of collaboration into a liability statement. Depp later called this experience death by confetti, a slow suffocation beneath polite smiles and professional betrayal. These weren't enemies. They were beneficiaries. people who profited from his success until association became risky. This moment shattered something fundamental for him, the belief that loyalty was reciprocal. He had assumed shared history meant shared courage. He was wrong, and this realization cut deeper than any headline. Because accusations damage reputation, but betrayal damages identity. The relationship at the center of the storm was never going to remain private. Volatility rarely does. What began as intensity escalated into emotional warfare, amplified by fame and fragility on both sides. Court testimony revealed cycles of conflict, reconciliation, escalation, and exhaustion. Depp portrayed himself not as dominant, but as avoidant, someone who withdrew rather than confronted. Whether one accepts that framing or not, what's clear is that this was not a healthy dynamic. It was combustible, and when it exploded publicly, it did so in a culture primed to pick sides instantly. The relationship became a proxy battlefield for larger societal arguments, stripping both individuals of complexity. Depp's version of events painted him as a man drowning rather than controlling. But drowning people don't look graceful. They look chaotic, and chaos rarely earns empathy. The British trial marked a turning point. The court ruled against Depp and the media treated it as final judgment. Context evaporated. Appeals became irrelevant. Headlines hardened into identity. From that moment forward, he was no longer Johnny Depp the actor, he was Johnny Depp the allegation. Studios responded accordingly. Phone calls stopped. Meetings disappeared. Projects dissolved without explanation. There was no public exile, just quiet erasure. Hollywood didn't condemn him. It simply removed him from the equation. This kind of disappearance is psychologically brutal because it offers no closure. There is no final conversation, no goodbye, just absence. And absence over time reshapes self-worth. Depp's removal from a major franchise wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as logistics, business decisions, brand safety. But language doesn't change impact. To an actor whose identity was built on creation, this was annihilation. He wasn't being judged on performance anymore. He was being judged on risk. And risk is impersonal. Risk doesn't care about truth. It cares about optics. Depp understood something important in that moment. Guilt and innocence no longer mattered. Only inconvenience did. That realization altered his relationship with fame forever. Rather than fight publicly, Depp vanished. Interviews stopped. Appearances dwindled. To outsiders, it looked like retreat. In reality, it was triage. He later admitted that continuing to speak would have turned him into content, not a person. Silence became a form of containment, but silence comes at a cost. When you don't tell your story, someone else always will, and they rarely do it gently. This period forced Depp into isolation with no distractions, no characters to hide inside. Just himself. This is where part 1 ends, not with resolution, but with disintegration. Johnny Depp didn't lose everything at once. He lost it layer by layer: trust, identity, professional belonging. What remained was a man stripped of narrative control, forced to confront who he was without applause. And what happens next isn't a comeback story. It's something quieter and far more revealing. After the noise faded, something unexpected happened. Without constant scrutiny, Depp was forced to listen not to critics, but to himself. For the first time in decades, there were no schedules demanding reinvention. No studios shaping perception. What remained was raw exposure. He later admitted that this period felt hollow, frightening, and necessary. Fame had always acted as insulation. Without it, every unresolved wound surfaced at once. This is where the real admission begins, not in court, but in solitude. Depp realized he had confused endurance with strength. He believed absorbing pain silently made him resilient. In truth, it was erasing him. Survival had become performance, and performance has limits. Music became refuge, not ambition, refuge. Long before acting, Depp was a guitarist searching for escape. Returning to music wasn't about relevance. It was about regulation. On stage, there were no verdicts, no narratives, just sound and presence. Music didn't ask him to explain himself. It didn't require moral positioning. It simply existed. That mattered. For someone whose life had been dissected endlessly, anonymity inside sound was healing. This shift marked the beginning of a different kind of recovery, one rooted in expression, not defense. When Depp returned to cinema, he did so on his own terms. Smaller projects, international productions, stories that didn't need him to be a symbol. This wasn't a redemption campaign, it was recalibration. Critics responded differently this time, not with adoration but with restraint. The applause he received wasn't explosive, it was respectful. And respect, after erasure, feels profound. Audiences weren't witnessing a comeback. They were witnessing endurance. There's a difference. One of the most revealing moments of this period didn't involve cameras. Dressed as a familiar character, Depp visited hospitalized children quietly. No press releases, no messaging, just presence. These moments mattered because they reflected who he was without narrative pressure. Not defending, not explaining, just listening. It showed a version of him untouched by controversy, the part fame had long buried. At 61, Depp finally articulated what had been forming internally for years. He described himself as a crash test dummy, not a martyr, but a test case. Someone who absorbed the impact of a cultural shift before systems understood how to process it. This wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. He understood that timing, not just behavior, shaped his fate. And that realization reframed everything. What hurt most wasn't public judgment. It was private absence. People who had celebrated him vanished. Loyalty, he learned, is conditional in systems built on fear. He stopped expecting fairness. Stopped believing success provided protection. Fame, he admitted, doesn't shield you. It exposes you. And once you see that clearly, you never unsee it. He also admitted underestimating the cost of silence. By refusing to speak early, he allowed others to define him. He assumed truth would surface organically. It didn't. Truth requires carriers. And without them, narratives harden into history. This wasn't self-pity. It was accountability. The most tragic admission was also the most liberating. Losing everything forced him to meet himself without distractions. No characters, no applause, just identity. And in that confrontation, he discovered something essential. Survival doesn't require public forgiveness. It requires self-recognition. Johnny Depp didn't rebuild by asking to be accepted again. He rebuilt by choosing meaning over validation, art over approval, quiet over spectacle. That choice changed everything. So the question remains, was his silence strength, or was it a mistake? Maybe it was both. Maybe silence protected his soul while costing his career. And maybe that trade-off is the real story, not scandal, not redemption, but what it means to survive public erasure and still recognize yourself in the mirror.